What's up everyone? Welcome back to another video here on Simply Car Things. Today a big mod is actually going down on my BMW F82 M4. As you can see, I have a set of KW V3 coilovers that are going to be installed today here at Studio RSR in Orange County, California. I'm actually with the owner of Studio RSR. This is Toby right over here. We do have a set of Ground Control Camber Plates that are also going to be going onto my car today. And I'm pretty excited because this is going to allow me to adjust the front camber on the front wheels of the M4. And with this coilover setup, I'll be able to dial in the ride height along with adjustability for the compression and rebound of the dampers on this car. I picked up this setup actually off of my buddy Gabe, who's a close friend of mine. You guys might know him as Blues Clues M3 on Instagram. He's a huge track guy. And this was actually his former setup on his F80, and it's been a proven setup. It worked really well for him. We do go to the same tracks in Southern California, so I have zero doubt that there's going to be any issues in terms of the overall performance of this setup with my car being installed on the M4.
Yeah, the cool thing is like we've been to the track with Gabe a few times. You guys can see videos of us tracking together as well.
Yeah.
Omar was there one time, I believe.
Yep.
So Gabe, you know, put these to work and got them set up really nicely. We actually had the chance to take them off the car and see if anything needed replacing, new rings, or having any rebuilds needed for it. Luckily, it's all good to go. So cleaned them up. They should be ready to go in the car. But these are amazing. So we've been waiting for these from Ground Control for a little bit, but definitely worth the wait. It's going to give you all that adjustability that, you know, whichever track you want to go to, like, oh, add some more camber.
Yeah, so. No, I feel like this is definitely something that's going to come in handy. And also, according to my understanding, this helps significantly reduce your tire wear. So due to a lot of the fabrication that was going on in the background that created a ton of background noise, I'm just going to be narrating over a lot of this install. Now, one thing I would like to mention that I didn't include in the intro is that, as you might be able to tell, this does not look like your average KW V3 coilover setup, and that is because there is one relatively major difference, which is the spring setup. Whereas the normal KW V3s run a KW progressive spring, this setup was actually swapped out by my friend to include a Swift linear spring up in the front with its own helper spring, and then also an Eibach linear spring for the rear with the Ground Control weight jack adjusters, which are able to adjust the height in the rear on that custom spring setup. So just diving straight into the install, the first thing that you're going to want to do right off the bat is take off the wheels on all four corners. Also want to lift up the trunk and go ahead and disconnect the battery. Make sure not to close the trunk as well. Leave it open or put something down where the latch is to make sure that it doesn't close on you. Then go ahead and pop the hood, and to start off with the front, as you can see in the video, you'll need to take your carbon fiber strut brace off, which isn't shown in the video because that was done beforehand, but it's going to be 8 13mm bolts and one 10mm bolt that is basically connected to the coolant expansion tank. Then from there, you'll want to remove some of the microfilter coverings and then the rubber cover that sits over the strut hat. It's held on with 2 plastic rivets. Now here's where things get a little bit interesting. Above the strut towers, like where the top hats are, there is like an aluminum brace or like a metal brace that sits over both the strut towers. If you have an early 2015 build model, you'll note that the top hat is actually a 3-bolt e-torque setup, but then later on in the late 2015 model years and then all the way up until like the LCI models, they're all 5 bolts now. So mine was a 5-bolt, but you may have a 3-bolt. It just depends on the build date. That's something that you can verify online. And once that's done, you're going to go ahead and just remove the EDC connector if you have EDC suspension at the top of the strut. Now that everything on the top is done, when you move over to the bottom where the strut is, you're going to want to remove the headlight leveling sensor and the wheel speed sensor. I don't believe there are any other sensors that sit on the strut itself, but they are sort of fastened to these brackets, and you'll want to just sort of undo them prior to actually removing the sensor itself. This tool right here is basically a spreader tool, and the tech that was doing the install in my car, Chris, he was showing me basically the functionality of it is that you can wedge it in between the knuckle that holds the strut and mounts it firmly into place. And what this allows you to do is pry that knuckle open so that you can actually get the strut out, because it sits in there with a ton of force, and if you don't have a tool like that, you'll need to use like a screwdriver or like anything really that you can utilize to pry it open. Also keep in mind there is a bolt that does need to be taken out that sits in the knuckle itself, and then you also have to disconnect the sway bar end link so that you can drop the control arm. Next, the 5 bolts on the top hat assembly are being removed, and then from there the strut is completely free and you can just pull it out from the underside of the fender well of the car. Upon reinstallation, normally what you would do is you would need a spring compressor in order to remove the top hat and replace it with the new KW coilover, but in this case, because I do have the ground control camber plates, that is not an issue. So you reinstall the strut back into the housing and you bolt everything back together. Upon reinstallation, it definitely helps to have a jack, because not only is it going to support the suspension assembly, but when you're actually reinstalling those bolts that go into the knuckle, it helps a bunch with getting the bolt to align in the bolt holes themselves. That's actually a problem that a lot of people encounter. So for those reasons, definitely use a jack, and basically that about sums up the install for the front. Making our way over to the rear section of the vehicle, for the install, the first thing that you're going to want to do is actually remove the 3 E-Torx bolts that mount the shock at the top of the suspension assembly. Then, as you can see here, Chris actually disconnected the headlight leveling sensor and then moved back to the top of the shock, where he compressed it just enough to where the EDC connector or the EDC sensor is basically able to be unplugged, and that is going to sit once again at the top of the shock itself. From there, all you need to do now is loosen 3 bolts on the lower control arm. Unfortunately, I don't know the sizes of the bolts, but they're not hard to access, so it's something that you can figure out pretty easily. The most inner bolt actually just needs to be loosened, just so you can allow the control arm to swivel downward, but then the 2 outermost lower control arm bolts are going to need to be removed completely. And once that's done, you can basically swing the lower control arm down and you can compress the shock and remove it out from the suspension assembly, like so. Now that that's all removed, there is a mount, or I really don't know what this is called, I honestly forgot, but that little thing that Chris is basically using a mallet to pop out is kind of what holds the rear spring in place at the top. So with the ground control weight jack adjusters, those are going to be installed as a replacement to that. And what's pretty cool about these is that if you take a 13mm socket, an extension, and a ratcheting wrench, as long as you just lift up the car, you can literally adjust the ride height just with the wrench. You just turn it clockwise to lower the car, or you turn it counterclockwise to raise the height of the car, and that's on the rear because of those adjusters, which is something that's pretty cool. Once those are installed, the new Eibach spring goes back into position, and from there we can begin to reinstall the outer control arm bolts. As you can see, once again, it is really useful to have some sort of jack. In this case, it was like a lift jack to help support the control arm so that the bolt can actually align into the hole, and then you can even use like a small mallet or hammer to sort of pop the bolt back into place, because sometimes it can be a little bit difficult. From here, you're basically done. It's just a matter of fastening up all the bolts, and I don't know the specific torque specs off the top of my head, but a lot of that information you can find online pretty easily. Once the control arm bolts are in, the shock is ready to be reinstalled, so just make sure to plug that EDC connector back in, and if you do have the KW EDC cancellation, well, at that point, that's really nice because you're not going to get a EDC malfunction when you start the car up, or you can just have it coated out, which I think is probably the better option to take, because you can get it coated out for much cheaper than what the EDC cancellation kit costs. Go ahead and reinstall those 3 E-Torx bolts, and from there you're pretty much done with the install. welcome to the driving portion of these KW V3 coilover impressions. So, now that you guys have seen the install, you guys have seen how everything goes down, you've also seen how the car looks now, and in my opinion, it looks so much better. I'm so happy with the way it turned out, and just having the adjustability of the height with this coilover suspension setup is really nice. And then on top of that, we can also adjust the rebound and the compression via a little rotary dial that basically has 5 separate settings, which is one thing that I actually have not touched yet. So everything is, I guess, on what you would consider a neutral setting, meaning that I have everything at the lowest setting right now. So like compression and rebound is all on its softest preset, and I will be honest, it is fairly bouncy. I definitely need to play around with it a little bit and fine tune these adjustments just for the sake of optimizing the ride quality and the handling benefits for my car. But overall already, I am very impressed. I would say there is an immediate handling improvement right off the bat here. I know some of you guys are gonna be asking, and so I'm just gonna address this right off the bat. In terms of the ride quality and how it affects the comfortability of the car, especially if you're someone that daily drives your M3 or M4, I will say there is a noticeable drop in the ride quality. The overall comfort and definitely the firmness of the dampers is increased. The comfort is somewhat decreased, and that's just going to be a given. If you're someone that truly values your EDC, I would recommend to just go with KW DDC, or just go with like lowering springs or something along those lines. So that way you still have the adjustability of your dampers, and you'll still get somewhat of a mild handling benefit along with a lower ride height, which is definitely something that anybody can appreciate on a car like this. It looks so much better. Now, if I'm being completely honest, I really haven't had a whole lot of time to drive on this new setup and really sort of test it out and see how the car handles with the KWs. Like I said, there is for sure a noticeable improvement, but the extent to which that improvement is present is something that I still cannot elaborate on just yet. I still need to break this setup in, and on top of that, I really need to drive the car at the limit to understand, you know, how much of a difference there really is. And I am going to Willow Springs International Raceway later this month, so I will definitely update you guys with some more driving impressions and handling characteristics based off this suspension. One of the most unintended benefits that I am unbelievably surprised about is how much better this car puts the power down now that it's on this KW suspension. I think with the lower ride height, the slightly firmer damper setup, and also the way that the shocks are able to travel now, in MDM settings, when I'm upshifting at wide open throttle, this car does not kick traction control in anymore. Gear shifts are smooth, they're instantaneous, they hit you really hard, and that is something that is so appreciated, because before this, on the EDC setup, every time I'd upshift at wide open throttle, the car would literally hesitate because the traction control was cutting power, and it was getting really frustrating, and it makes it more tempting to want to just drive with traction control off. But I think for the street, that's kind of dangerous, especially if you're not a really good driver. Ask me how I know. And just even right now, I mean, I'm driving on the street here, but just the way that I'm able to sort of turn the car into these corners, it feels direct. I would say there's a little bit more feedback that comes through the steering wheel now as well with the suspension setup, but really it's not a ton, and it's not anything that is going to be a significant improvement. So I think for now, that's just going to wrap up the initial impressions. Once again, huge shout out to Studio RSR for doing the install and helping me out with everything related to my suspension setup, including the KW V3 coilovers and the Ground Control Camber Plates. I'm extremely pleased with the setup, and again, all their contact info will be linked in the description box down below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, including the product overview, the installation, the impressions, seeing how the car looks. I think overall we did a good job of just overviewing the KW suspension. And trust me guys, I'll have plenty of other updates coming in the near future regarding this suspension and how it feels, long-term impressions, and all that sort of stuff. So with all that being said, thank you so much for tuning into the video. I appreciate your viewership. I will catch you all in the next one. Take it easy, my friends. Bye-bye.